The 1932 presidential election showed that Americans were clearly ready for a change. Because of the Depression, people were suffering from lack of work, food, and hope. Republicans again nominated Hoover as their candidate, but too many Americans blamed Hoover for doing too little about the Depression. Democrats nominated the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's can-do attitude won him nearly 23 million votes and an easy victory in the election. Democrats also won two-thirds majority in the Senate and three-fourths of the seats in the House of Representatives. 4 months would elapse between Roosevelt's election in November and his inauguration in March 1933. The 20th Amendment, which moved presidential inaugurations to January, would be ratified in February 1933 to ease this problem. During these 4 months, Hoover was a lame duck president. He could do little to improve the country's situation. Roosevelt, however, was not idle. He convened a group of hand-picked advisors known as the Brain Trust. This group immediately began to formulate policies to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression. These policies became known as the New Deal and would be implemented immediately upon Roosevelt's inauguration. New Deal policies focused on three goals: relief for the needy, economic recovery, and financial reform. On taking office, FDR's administration launched a period of intense activity known as the 100 Days, lasting from March 9th to June 16th, 1933. During this time, Congress passed more than 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation. These laws, and others that followed, significantly expanded the federal role's government in the nation's economy. FDR's first step as president was to carry out reforms in banking and finance. By 1933, widespread bank failures had caused most Americans to lose faith in the banking system. On March 5th, one day after taking office, FDR declared a bank holiday and closed all banks to prevent further withdrawals. He persuaded Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which authorized the Treasury Department to inspect the country's banks. Those that were sound would reopen at once. Those that were insolvent would remain closed and would receive loans. This measure revived public confidence in banks. Another step taken by Congress to reorganize the banking system was the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. This act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. The FDIC provided federal insurance for individual bank accounts up to $5,000. It reassured millions of bank customers that their money was safe. Congress also worked with FDR to regulate the stock market. In May 1933, Congress passed the Federal Securities Act, which required corporations to provide complete information on all stock offerings and made them liable for any misrepresentations. In June 1934, Congress also established the Security Exchange Commission, or SEC, that prevented insider trading. Finally, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to approve a bill allowing the manufacture and sale of some alcoholic beverages. The bill's main purpose was to boost government revenues by taxing alcohol. By the end of 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition altogether. While working with banking and financial matters, FDR also implemented programs to provide relief to farmers, perhaps the hardest hit of the Depression. It also aided other workers and attempted to stimulate economic recovery. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, sought to raise crop prices by lowering production. The government achieved this by paying farmers not to plant certain percentage of their acreage. The theory was that a reduced supply would raise demand and thus also raise prices. The program was successful and did raise farm prices, thus putting more money in farmers' pockets. An especially ambitious program was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. This program focused on the badly depressed Tennessee Valley. It renovated 5 existing dams and constructed 20 new ones, thus providing electricity, flood control, and other benefits to an impoverished region. The administration also established programs to provide relief through work projects and cash payments. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, put young men aged 18 to 25 to work building roads, developing parks, planting trees, and helping in soil erosion and flood control projects. By the time the program ended in 1942, 3 million men had passed through the CCC. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, provided money to states to create jobs in the construction of schools and other public buildings through two programs, the Public Works Administration, or PWA, and the Civil Works Administration, or CWA. Some critics of these make work programs claim they were a waste of money. The NIRA also sought to promote industrial growth by establishing codes of fair practice for individual industries. It created the National Recovery Act, or NRA, which set prices of many products and established standards in many industries. The aim of the NRA was to promote recovery by interrupting the trend of wage cuts, falling prices, and layoffs. Opponents of the NRA charged that the code served large business interests. There were also charges of increasing code violations. A number of New Deal programs concerned housing and home mortgage problems. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, provided government loans to homeowners who faced foreclosure. The National Housing Act created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, which continues to furnish loans for home mortgages and repairs to this day. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, was established to provide direct relief to the needy. Half of the money was given to the states as grants and aid to help furnish food and clothing to the unemployed, the aged, and the ill. By the end of the 100 days, millions of Americans had benefited from New Deal programs, and the public's confidence in the nation's future had rebounded. FDR had reluctantly adopted a policy of deficit spending more money than the government received in revenues. He regarded deficit spending as a necessary evil to be used only in a time of great economic crisis. Nevertheless, the New Deal did not end the Depression, and opposition grew among some parts of the population. Liberal critics argued that the New Deal did not go far enough to help the poor and reform the nation's economic system. Conservatives, on the other hand, argued that FDR spent too much on direct relief and used New Deal policies to control business and socialize the economy. They were particularly angered by the AAA and the NIRA, which they believed gave the federal government too much control over agriculture and industry and interfered with a free market economy. By the mid-1930s, conservative opposition to the New Deal received a boost from two Supreme Court decisions. In 1935, the court declared the NIRA unconstitutional on the grounds that the law gave legislative powers to the executive branch, and that the enforcement of industrial codes within states went beyond the federal government's constitutional powers to regulate interstate commerce. In 1936, the court struck down the AAA on the grounds that agriculture is a local matter and should be regulated by the states, not the federal government. Fearing that further court decisions might dismantle the New Deal, FDR proposed in 1937 that Congress enact a court reform bill to reorganize the federal judiciary and allow FDR to appoint 6 new Supreme Court justices. This court packing bill aroused a storm of protest in Congress and the press. Many people believed this violated the principle of separation of powers. In the end, FDR got his way when an elderly justice retired, and FDR appointed the liberal Hugo S. Black, shifting the balance of power in the Supreme Court. The rulings of the court began to favor the New Deal, and Roosevelt dropped his suggestion of packing the court. Over the next 4 years, FDR was able to appoint 7 new justices as a result of further resignations. Perhaps the most serious challenge to the New Deal came from Louisiana Senator Huey Long. Long was an early supporter of the New Deal who eventually turned against FDR. Long proposed a nationwide social program called Share Our Wealth, in which he seemed to promise something for everyone. Long's program was gaining popularity when a lone assassin gunned him down in 1935. As the initial impetus of the New Deal began to wane, FDR started to look ahead. He knew much more needed to be done to help the people and solve the nation's economic problems. By 1935, FDR was seeking ways to build on the programs established in the first 100 days. Although the economy had improved during FDR's first 2 years in office, the gains were not as great as he had expected. Unemployment remained high and production still lagged behind the levels of the 1920s. Yet the New Deal enjoyed widespread popularity. FDR launched a second period of intense activity labeled the Second 100 Days, or the Second New Deal. During this phase, FDR called on Congress to provide more extensive relief for farmers and workers. His wife, Eleanor, who proved to be one of his strongest advisors on domestic policies, prodded the president in this direction. The Second New Deal was underway by the time of the 1936 presidential election, in which Roosevelt won election to a second term, and the Democrats again scored a major victory in Congress. It was a vote of confidence for FDR and the New Deal. When the Supreme Court struck down the AAA in 1936, Congress passed another law to replace it, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. This act paid farmers for cutting production of soil-depleting crops and rewarded farmers for practicing good soil conservation methods. In 1938, Congress approved the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act that brought back many features of the first. The second AAA did not include a processing tax to pay for farm subsidies, which was the provision of the AAA that the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional. The Resettlement Administration of 1935 provided loans to small farmers to buy land. This agency was replaced in 1937 by the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, which loaned more than $1 billion to tenant farmers to become landholders. As part of the Second New Deal, FDR and Congress set up a series of programs to help youths, professionals, and other workers. One of the largest was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The WPA set out to create as many jobs as possible between 1935 and 1943. It spent over $11 billion to give jobs to more than 8 million workers, most of them unskilled. The WPA was the program most directly responsible for creating new jobs and putting people back to work. It resulted in the construction of 850 airports, 651,000 miles of road, and more than 125,000 public buildings. Women workers produced over 300 million garments for the needy under this plan. The National Youth Administration, or NYA, was created specifically to provide education, jobs, counseling, and recreation for young people. It provided student aid to high school, college, and graduate students. In exchange, students worked part-time at their schools. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared the NIRA unconstitutional, citing that the federal government had violated legislative authority reserved for the states. One of the first reforms of the Second New Deal was passage of the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, more commonly known as the Wagner Act. The act reestablished the NIRA provision of collective bargaining, and the federal government again protected the right of workers to join unions. The Wagner Act also prohibited unfair labor practices such as threatening workers, firing union members, and interfering with union organizing. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It set a maximum work hours of 44 hours per week, decreasing to 40 hours by 1940, and set minimum wage at 25 cents per hour, increasing to 40 cents per hour by 1945. In addition, the Act set rules for the employment of workers under 16 and banned hazardous work for those under 18. One of the most important achievements of the Second New Deal was the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935. The Social Security Act provides old age insurance for retirees 65 or older and their spouses, unemployment compensation, and aid to families with dependent children and the disabled. The Social Security Act was one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation to come from the New Deal and has had the greatest long-term impact on the U.S. The Second New Deal also included laws to promote rural electrification and regulate public utilities. In 1935, only 12.6% of rural farms in the United States had electricity. FDR established the Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, to finance and bring electricity to rural areas. By 1946, 90% of rural farms had electricity. The New Deal also represented an important opportunity for minorities and women, but what these groups gained was limited. Long-standing patterns of prejudice and discrimination continued to plague them and to prevent their full and equal participation in national life. One of the most notable changes during the New Deal was the naming of several women to important government positions. Frances Perkins became America's first female cabinet member when FDR appointed her to serve as Secretary of Labor. Perkins played a major role in creating the Social Security system and supervised labor legislation. FDR, encouraged by his wife Eleanor, appointed 2 female diplomats and a female federal court judge. But women continued to face discrimination in the workplace from male workers who believed working women took jobs away from men. Even some New Deal programs discriminated. For example, the NRA set lower minimum wage standards for women than for men. In spite of these barriers, women continued their upward movement in the workplace, and women continued to work outside the home. The 1930s witnessed a growth of activism among African Americans. This activism laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Civil Rights Movement. During the New Deal, FDR appointed more than 100 African Americans to key positions in the government. Mary McLeod Bethune, an educator who dedicated herself to promoting opportunities for young African Americans, was one such appointee. FDR hired Bethune to head the Division of Negro Affairs of the NYA. Bethune also helped FDR organize a black cabinet of influential African Americans to advise the president on racial issues. Despite efforts to promote racial equality, FDR never committed to full civil rights for African Americans. He was afraid of upsetting white Democratic voters in the South, an important segment of his support. He refused to approve federal anti-lynching legislation and also refused to end the poll tax, 2 key goals of the civil rights movement. Further, a number of New Deal programs clearly discriminated against African Americans, including the NRA, the CCC, and the TVA. These programs gave lower wages to African Americans and favored whites. In general, African Americans supported FDR's administration and the New Deal, generally seeing them as the best hope for the future. Full civil rights was simply an issue during the 1930s and 40s whose time had not yet come. Mexican Americans also tended to support the New Deal, even though they received fewer benefits than did African Americans. Although the CCC and WPA helped many Mexican Americans, these agencies also discriminated against them by disqualifying them from programs as migrant workers who had no permanent address. Native Americans received strong government support from the New Deal. In 1924, Native Americans gained full citizenship by law. In 1933, FDR appointed John Collier as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier helped create the Indian Reservation Act of 1934. This act was an extreme change in government policy. It moved away from assimilation and toward Native American autonomy. The Indian Reservation Act of 1934 helped restore some tribal lands, allowed children to attend school on reservations, and tribes were given permission to elect tribal councils to govern their reservations. Many viewed this act as an important step forward, while others objected that once again whites were trying to tell Native Americans what was best for them. Although New Deal policies had mixed results for minorities, these groups generally supported FDR. In fact, one of FDR's greatest achievements was to create the New Deal Coalition, an alignment of diverse groups dedicated to supporting the Democratic Party. The coalition included Southern whites, various urban groups, African Americans, and unionized industrial workers. As a result, Democrats dominated national politics through the 1930s and 1940s. Also, as a result of this broad base of support, Roosevelt won a second term in office in 1936, carrying the nation's 12 largest cities. The 1930s were a profitable and golden age for motion pictures. By late in the decade, approximately 65% of the population went to the movies once a week. The nation boasted over 15,000 movie theaters. New stars such as Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, and James Cagney became popular. Some films made during the Depression offered pure escape from hardship. The first fully animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, was released by Walt Disney in 1937. Perhaps one of the most popular films of all time, Gone with the Wind, was released in 1939. Also released in 1939, The Wizard of Oz. Several films by director Frank Capra presented the social and political accomplishments of the New Deal in a positive light, including Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Capra also released the Christmas favorite It's a Wonderful Life during the Depression. Sales of radios increased during the 1930s from just over 13 million in 1930 to 28 million in 1940. Nearly 90% of American households owned a radio. Even more than movies, radio embodied the democratic spirit of the times. Families typically spent several hours a day gathered together listening to their favorite programs. It was no accident that FDR chose radio as the medium for his fireside chats. Orson Welles created one of the most renowned radio broadcasts of all times, The War of the Worlds. Children's programs included such hits as The Green Hornet and The Lone Ranger. The Federal Art Project, a branch of the WPA, paid artists a living wage to produce public art. It also aimed to increase public appreciation of art and to promote positive images of American society. Perhaps one of the most famous works of art to come from this Depression era was Grant Wood's American Gothic. Experiencing firsthand the tragedies of the Depression, singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie used music to capture the hardships of the times. Guthrie's honest lyrics appealed to those who suffered similar hardships. In literature, John Steinbeck, one of the country's most famous authors, received assistance from the Federal Writers Project. He published his epic novel, The Grapes of Wrath, in 1939. The novel revealed the lives of Oklahomans fleeing the Dust Bowl, only to find things were not much better once they arrived in California. Although artists and writers recognized America's flaws, they contributed positively to the New Deal legacy. They praised the virtues of American life and took pride in the country's traditions and accomplishments. During his second term in office, FDR hinted at plans for a third New Deal. In his inaugural address, FDR stated, "I see 1/3 of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished." However, FDR did not favor deficit spending. More importantly, by 1937, the economy had improved enough to convince many Americans that the Depression was finally ending. Although economic troubles still plagued the nation, FDR faced rising pressure from Congress to scale back New Deal programs, which he did. As a result, industrial production dropped again and unemployment began to rise in 1938. By 1939, the New Deal was effectively over, and FDR was increasingly concerned with events in Europe and the Pacific. Over time, opinions about the New Deal have ranged from harsh criticism to high praise. Most conservatives think FDR's policies made the federal government too large and too powerful. They believe that the large government stifled free enterprise and individual initiative. Liberal critics offered that FDR didn't do enough to socialize the economy and eliminate social and economic inequalities. Supporters of the New Deal contend that FDR struck a reasonable balance between the two extremes, unregulated capitalism and overregulated socialism, and helped the country to recover from its economic difficulties. In truth, only the Second World War would pull the country out of the Great Depression. FDR's administration expanded the power of the federal government, giving it, and particularly the president, a more active role in shaping the economy. The federal government also established agencies such as the FDIC, and the SEC to regulate banking and investment activities. Although the New Deal did not end the Great Depression, it did help reduce the suffering of thousands of men, women, and children by by providing them with jobs, food, and money. It also gave people hope and helped them regain a sense of dignity. The federal government had to go deeply in debt to provide jobs. The federal deficit increased to $2.9 billion in 1934. What really ended the Depression, however, as I just mentioned, was the massive amount of spending by the federal government for war material needed for World War II. During the war, the deficit would reach a high of about $54.5 billion.